Let me introduce our marvelous two panelists, and I'm very eager to get them talking because they have a lot of important things to say. As I introduce them, they'll come up here and take their seats, and then we'll get the panel discussion going. Don Carter is an alumnus of our School of Architecture. He became a very prominent practicing architect as a principal at the Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh, a world-renowned firm for their work in urban planning and design. And he retired as the president of Urban Design Associates recently. We were very, very pleased to be able to coax him back to Carnegie Mellon, where he now serves as the David Lewis Director of Urban Design and Regional Engagement, and as Director of the Remaking Cities Institute, which I mentioned to you before. Don Carter, would you please join me up here? And I'm very pleased to introduce to you also a distinguished alumnus from here in Mumbai, Parag Parekh, who's a practicing architect. He received his master's degree in architecture from Carnegie Mellon and returned here to work in what was his father's firm, J.P. Parekh and Son Architects. You may know it as JPP, which has done some very important buildings here in Mumbai, and they continue to do some excellent work. One of their focuses has been on sustainable development as well as technical excellence, and Parekh is a perfect panelist to join us here tonight. Parekh, please join me up here. Let me start with you, Don. A question particularly designed for you. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have been a practicing architect for most of your career, and now you've come back to the other side as a teacher. I think we'd all be very interested in your observations about what you think architecture students need to be learning and what they need to know to be effective urban designers and architects in the future.
Thank you, Jerry. And I'm so glad to be here. This is my first visit to India. My firm is international, and we actually have two projects ongoing right now. We have a project in Jamnagar in Gujarat for SR, designing a new town next to one of their oil refineries, and we have a project at Ludhiana in the Punjab for Ario, which is a real estate development firm. Both of those projects are about 3,000 to 4,000 housing units. And so I've had a lot of staff here for the last 3 or 4 years, but this is my first visit. And they said I would really enjoy it, and I certainly have enjoyed it. But as Jerry said, I have worked 36 years in my firm, starting as a regional firm and then growing to an international firm, as we've said here. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I started thinking about whether I would take the invitation that Carnegie Mellon had given to me, was to teach part-time on campus. And I thought, well, I've never taught, but I've certainly practiced, and I've done a lot of work, and the experience I have probably would be helpful for students. So I thought I would just be a part-time professor, and then the job came up for being the director of the Remaking Cities Institute. So I very boldly wrote a manifesto for what urban designers need to know, kind of what I called the 6 essential practice elements of urban design. And they are, number 1, and most important, was public participation, public engagement. A second one was engaging major stakeholders. That's different than public participation. I'll talk about each of these a little bit. I just wanted to get all 6 out. The third one is working in multidisciplinary teams. And having been a graduate of Carnegie Mellon, I've already experienced what that means. A fourth one is about respecting context and heritage, where you practice. The fifth one is sustainable design, which is what our topic is here tonight, but it's what architects and urban designers need to know. And the last element is implementation. You've got to get something done. So you just don't do a plan without knowing who's going to carry out the plan, where the money's going to come from, and what do you start with first. And just a little bit about each of those. The public participation is very interesting in that I'm teaching an urban seminar, and 2/3 of my students are either from China or India. And it's not as if China or India are known for their public engagement and public planning processes. And these young students are just hungry for this information. And I start off the class by giving them a quote from Thomas Jefferson about public participation, one of the great founders of our republic. "I know of no depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take the discretion from them, but to inform their discretion." So public participation is also an educational process. Engagement of major stakeholders is kind of what is happening in China and India now. The government, the major developers, major corporations, they're the ones that make these decisions. They also must be included. It's not as if the public is the only source of it. So I say to the students, you must engage those people as well. The multidisciplinary teams, that means sociologists, market consultants, ecologists, historic preservation people, civil engineers, a whole range of people. And what I point out to them is the architect and the urban designer is the person who has to lead this team. So you better know what those fields are about and what they can contribute to your project. The fourth being context and heritage. And this is something we're particularly working on in Ludhiana right now, in which we're working with regional architectural forms rather than importing a new form from Europe or the United States or somewhere else. And that's kind of an alien concept too, because as you well know, a lot of the development in India is using forms of development that aren't necessarily indigenous to this region. And we believe very strongly that the thousands of years of tradition of any city or culture should be retained. Sustainable design, I think, goes without too much emphasis now, because that's what we'll be talking about tonight. But that's everything from green buildings, which Parag is working on, to a whole regional planning process around water resources and things like that. And the last thing is implementation as a focus, basically. Where's the money coming from? Who's going to do it? And my young employees at my firm and the students I'm teaching, I think they really get that and they commit to it. This new generation really believes in some of the things we're talking about. And the students from China and India want to take this back and to make a difference when they're there. And I quote a Native American proverb to them that they find a very emotional moment when we talk about this. And this is the quote: "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned by your children. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." And they really get that message.
That's great.
Thanks.
I hope all of your students are paying attention. Parag, the word sustainability is used very frequently today, or sustainable as an adjective. I wonder if you could help us early on here to define what a sustainable building is, and maybe give us a sense of how a sustainable building differs from non-sustainable buildings or buildings that we know of in the past.
Before I start, thanks a lot, Dr. Cohon, Srinivas, for having me here. It's a great honor to be part of this panel discussion. So sustainability, if you look at what is sustainability, I think it is a relationship between two very complex living systems, I mean humans, and other living systems. So the nature of building activity itself has an impact on the environment. So just to put it very simply, because it's a buzzword, sustainability is about, I mean, a sustainable design of a sustainable building is about design, about building and operating a building which has a minimum effect on the environment in its entire lifespan. It's not just the act of designing a building, because all through the process of actually realizing the building and then operating, there is an effect on the environment. So sustainable building practices look at the entire lifespan, right from design to operation. And so we have at Carnegie Mellon the building performance unit. I mean, we, in our practice in Mumbai, we look at the same approach that we learned there, which is a holistic approach to designing buildings. It is not looking in individual systems and getting the best of energy efficient equipment and trying to make sustainable buildings. But it's about buildings where all systems have where you can see the effect of a system on the other system. For example, when you choose a building envelope or you choose a material, what would be the effect on the cooling and the lighting loads? A glazing system design, whether it will deliver or whether it will talk to the lighting system. And as soon as you have daylight, whether the lighting system will turn off or dim. So it's about integrating all systems and seeing the effect of one on the other. That's what differentiates largely a sustainable building from a normal building. And the approach largely guides whether you take a holistic approach or an integrated approach to design, or you choose technologies and fit into design to achieve a particular rating or to make them green buildings. So this is the general difference. The advantage in sustainable buildings is you have aesthetics and sustainable criteria complementing each other. There is no debate about form or function. Both become justified on their own. So therefore it has helped us here in projects where we've been able to do sustainable buildings. You can't do it in all projects in Bombay, but where we have that, it's easy to talk about both form and function in the same blend. So this.
Yeah, let's talk about Mumbai. Let's make this specific, but just a little context first. It's already the case, of course, that the world's larger urban areas are suffering now in terms of coping with providing city services to its citizens, to providing a quality of life which is tolerable for a lot of people. Mumbai is, I believe, the 6th largest city in the world, with something like 20 million people. Is that right? It's huge. As challenging as the present is, though, the future is going to be much more challenging, because the world continues to urbanize at a very rapid pace. And 20 million will not be a surprise or strange. There will be many, many cities that big and larger. So there's some urgency to figuring out what sustainable urban design means and implementing it. Okay, with that as context, let's talk about Mumbai. What do you see as the challenges, and how do we go about addressing them? And this is a question for both of you, not just...
I think India as well. I think the diagnosis is well known. What we have here is a situation where we're depleting natural resources, deforesting, we're drawing down the aquifers, we're expanding in urbanization without planning. Projects can pop up almost anywhere. You have problems of public sanitation, multiple ownership of properties. It's very hard to assemble things. And in my view as an architect, I've seen in the last 15 to 20 years, not only in India, but in China and in the Middle East, importation of architectural and urban design models that we in the West have rejected, that were done in the 70s and 80s, this kind of sprawl, auto-oriented development. And you're exactly right about the population. And we're talking right now, say 30%, in the last figure, 30% of the population of India is urban, for a population of 1.1, 1.2 billion. But by 2030, it'll be a population of 1.5 billion, and 50% of that will be urban. They will, by that time, India will have been exceeding China in population. It will be the largest population in the world. So the explosive growth is going to be something very difficult to deal with. So what do we do? And it's not as if India is not thinking about it. I mean, a month ago, almost to the day, Prime Minister Singh opened up the 10th Delhi, what's it called, the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit, talking about, and something that Parag and I have already talked about today, you have this sustainable development, and we think about it as physical development. But he was saying, Our country cannot just deal with climate control and sustainable development with also not talking about sustainable development in social terms, because we've got this incredible poverty in this country. 20% of the people in India live in those so-called slums. And maybe Mumbai might be double that in percentage. It might be 40% living in these slums. So it's one thing to talk about green buildings and green roofs. It's another thing to say, what might you do about it? Now, I have some things I might talk about, but I think Parag wanted to weigh in on some of the issues so we can get all the bad stuff out first.
So what's happening is today in Mumbai, and as he says, largely in India, there is a large shift in lifestyle. The economic conditions are improving across cities and in rural economies. And by this, what happens is, once the rural lifestyle, which depends on traditional fuel systems or energy systems, starts changing towards an urban lifestyle, which with the systems we rely on are all natural resources to heat and cool our buildings, and we're not. So this shift is causing more and more demands on energy and the resulting issues of emissions. Almost 90% of an energy in a commercial building goes in just heating and cooling. In a residential building, it's almost 60%. So what has worked in the past is looking at adaptations of green buildings and trying to mimic them or trying to adapt them will no longer be applicable on a larger scale, because they are fairly resource demanding, and we as a country cannot afford that kind of consumption. So we will have to go back. We've seen projects designed by us where we have to go back to the first principles of design, look at design solutions which are context-based, which are based on considering cooling criteria on natural phenomena, not just mechanical. So this is the kind of approach that will shift in terms of doing sustainable buildings to meet this growth that is happening. Because no longer can we just buy more glass, which is energy efficient, or just buy units which consume less power, because that is all resource hungry. We need to go back to our traditional solar shading devices, use controlled facades, so that we design more for the context, and that will be what we feel addressing these issues, because more and more is the demand.
I have some questions.
Yes.
This, but I don't want to cut you off.
In terms of smart growth, the principles of smart growth is a design for people, not automobiles, to be sensitive to nature, to bring nature back into the city. There's a whole international movement now is to bring nature back into the city, or at least connect to it in a way. Public transportation is the key to these concentrations of urban mega cities like Mumbai is, and like Calcutta is, and like Delhi and Jakarta, and Lagos, Nigeria, they think might be a city of 50 million people. Imagine in the next 20 years it would be that way. Revitalization of the inner city. Some of the projects Parag is doing are taking old industrial properties and reclaiming it for higher density housing, which gives you the opportunity to have transient development. And the idea of having urban growth boundaries. It's very important that we don't have the sprawl just continuing in any which way it wants to go. There has to be a national policy and a state policy. And then right now in India, the states all control things in different ways, and the national policy is not really adequate from what we can gather. So those are the things that we need in these long-term visions. We just came from Singapore, where they plan as well as anybody I've ever seen. They're doing a 45-year concept plan for the year 2055. They've figured out what they want to do, and they've worked their capital investments around that.
I'm trying to plan next week, 2055. So let me pick up on this last point you made about policy, and direct this particularly at Parag, but of course anybody can chime in here. Let me pose it this way. Do the developers you work with get this, and are they interested in sustainable design and sustainable planning? And if not, or even if they do, what about local and state officials? Are they embracing this, and are they developing the policies they need to make it happen?
In fact, on that, we are very positive. There is a lot of work happening The rate of work is slow. I mean, we would wish policies get implemented much faster before, again, the growth pattern changes. But there have been various government initiatives to look at, much more efficient buildings, efficient cities. I'll give you an example. At the basic building level codes, there is now compliance on environmental norms necessary, mandatory for large projects. As far as city level codes go, we have recently in Mumbai, the approach of the government has been to encourage cluster development. What we mean by, rather, because earlier there was no difference whether you develop one standalone building, you would get the same FAR, or you develop 10 buildings. So it never led to, it led to pockets of development on wherever you could. Now the government is promoting cluster development by giving much more incentive for larger number of plot owners to come together, so that a development could be planned, which can create certain open spaces, for example, inner city open spaces, where you will be able to plan in a much more free manner than just within a plot. So there is movement at city level to promote cluster redevelopment. Large parts of Mumbai are being, there is talk of remaking of Mumbai Federation, looking at large parts of Mumbai getting redeveloped in larger pockets rather than smaller pieces of land. As far as at the state level or at the center level goes, we have the energy code coming in place, which is voluntary for the first 2 years, and then it becomes compulsory. Buildings have to comply with an energy code. We will look at times when there will be an energy audits, and like you have star labeling for electronic devices, buildings will be labeled, and those who are responsible will be rewarded, and those who won't will have to face penalties. So there is a lot of movement to understand this issue. If you develop new cities, again there is incentive for eco housing. So there is the government has recognized these issues fairly positively, I think.
I'd like to add one point which Parag can elaborate, because it connects what.
Use the mic, okay?
What is our president's one of the area of interest? Is it on? Yeah, that is water resources. Because there is acute shortage of water, this summer we may not have water. There is a big movement for rain harvesting, which Parag can elaborate, and the local government and the municipal corporation is already involved in it. There is one area where a lot of work is being done and is going to be done. Other area which would be of interest to the Dean Carter would be in the area of transportation. I would like to know today in this panel how many people have reached here by public transport. Can I have the show of hands, please? Only one.
Walked down, we took the elevator down from our
I
room,
left my
so-
office in Santa Cruz East around 5:45, went to my residence in Santa Cruz West and left at 5 minutes past 6. I was here 10 minutes before 7 by taking a fast train, which I took it from Bandra, which stopped only at Dadar and dropped me at Dadar, at Churchgate. And of course, both the places I have to take a taxi. And most of the Mumbai commutes like this.
Well, that's one of the issues. The sale of cars in the last 5 years in this country has been explosive. Almost all the new development has been auto-oriented. Do you have an extended transit lines or bus lines to those places? The growing middle class all wants to have a car, maybe 2 cars. Can't park them. There's no place in the city to park them, so it's a big issue. You were going to ask another question.
Well, actually, this is a building on that.
Okay.
In your business, in your profession, does any country stand out in terms of being enlightened and progressive when it comes to urban design, especially, either through policy or?
Well, certainly Singapore. Just having been there and meeting with the Urban Redevelopment Authority, it's quite organized and progressive. I think a lot of the Scandinavian cities are quite well planned, and many of the European cities are transit-oriented and walkable communities. Although if you look on the outskirts of Paris, the outskirts of any of those European cities, they're also creating big shopping malls and standalone office parks and things that are not sustainable. And partly it's driven by demand, market demand. The middle class wants to have the car, wants to go to the shopping mall. But the cores of those cities are quite livable and are not auto-dependent. They're really walkable.
And the lessons learned in places like that would be portable to a much bigger city like Mumbai?
Yes, absolutely. But the transport systems, the idea of building more housing, a variety of housing. I mean, to think of 40% of the population living in what you can see in the slums, that has to be dealt with. But the country only has limited resources.
Right.
So that's why the visionary plan needs to be in place. What do we do first? What do we do second? And it's a big burden to carry.
So it deals a lot with the way Bombay is shaped. I mean, you have water on every other side. You can't grow except north, and and there is an inertia to move seats of power, seats of law, business away from the south of Mumbai. So the issue gets compounded daily with people coming all the way down to South Mumbai, whether it's public transport or private transport, where you could just like smart growth policies that CMU advocates, you could decentralize, you could change the zonings, or land use could be made much more efficient, by which you don't need to add to the transport problems just because you can't shift from a place to the other. Also, because of the way you can't grow, there is a lot of demand on all the remaining land which is left in Bombay to become buildable, because the city grows whatever we do. It's an economic issue, and there is a demand so much on land that slowly we are losing our historic areas, our areas which are culturally rich, just because of the pressures of development. I mean, smart growth looks at making alternate use of lands, making mixed use policies. All these would help reduce the pressure on mainland city land.
And one of the theories that I'm seeing in some of the journals, in Indian planning journals, is the idea is that the smaller cities really should absorb the growth. That the mega cities have had it. I mean, you can't go too much more than they are. But there are something like 20 or 30 cities in India that are more than 1 million population, and many of them could absorb growth. And so there's that thought that maybe you have a multi-nuclear region where you have town centers and viable smaller towns, then try to absorb everything in 4 or 5 big megacities.
Don't be shy. Yes, here, we'll start over here with Sanjay. Go ahead, please, Sanjay.
Yeah, all this is extremely interesting and all that, but I think the basic problem in India is you have to have the political will to implement these programs, and I think the entire sustainability issue really in India in particular revolves around how the politicians and those in power view the situation with regard to their electability. And one of the reasons that we have all these slums is because the slums are the vote banks of the parties, and the parties in power will never get rid of these slums. And you may organize all sorts of other developments for them, but unless they have this vote bank, they'll never get re-elected.
It also has a lot to do with the will of the government, as he says. I mean, if you see Singapore, public housing is still the responsibility of the government. It controls the speculation in the market, and it provides quality housing stock. Here, the model is more to shift the responsibility onto private developers, enter into private partnerships, and abdicate your responsibility of actually being the providers for public housing. Our delivery systems are weak. The quality of the product that the government delivers is not up to mark. So therefore, is this whole issue of will. Either if you invite developers to be your partners for public housing, I mean, it goes against the whole idea of affordability and making affordable housing for the masses, which actually in other countries is still the responsibility taken by the government. So he's right in the sense that if there's a will, a lot more could be done in these issues for the mass in general.
I think we can say that India is more enlightened than they were 5 years ago,
Yes.
or 10 years ago, and the progress has been slow.
Yes.
But at least it's a dialogue people are
Yes.
having. And there are some models to point to and say, at least we've tried it here, and there's an economic benefit to sustainable design
Yes.
that Parag knows quite well.
You don't look convinced, Sanjay, but that, one thing that has to be observed is, of course, these issues are highly political everywhere in the world. I mean, there's no place, you can't do these things without, as they say in American English, goring someone's ox. Someone is going to lose, or they'll be perceived as losing, and someone's going to perceive as having won. And so it's inherently political. But it does, I agree completely, at some point it requires political leadership. Someone to stand up and basically risk their political careers on achieving this kind of progress. That's certainly true.
Yeah, Jay Raval again. Now I was talking earlier with some of the people. I ended up at CMU and worked in a multidisciplinary group called Transportation Research. And I had decided to come back. And I was interviewed by a number of, very few people wanted to come back. In fact, that was a story in 1970. I was interviewed by two government organizations, and both of them gave me very good offer. One was Indian Space Research Organization, but I didn't want to work for a pure government. The second was CIDCO, and I was interviewed in Washington, D.C. by Shirish Patel and Mr. D'Souza, who were instrumental. And I listened to them because I was from Carnegie Mellon University. We had total multidisciplinary, multinational group which was there. And thinking always was to look at transportation problem in totality, as Dean Carter said, that it has to be seen in totality. And these people were planning a city in New Mumbai, and the first thing I asked that what about transportation link? Because just now I said a few minutes back that it took 45 to 50 minutes for me to reach here. City of Mumbai runs on trains, rapid transit. They said, no, we don't want to put a rapid transit between Mumbai to New Mumbai, we wanted a standalone. And all of us who have lived here can see, ultimately they have to put it, and now they are going to extend it, but it's very late. Again in 71, I had detailed presentation with the Railway Ministry to have underground transportation, at least to connect Churchgate and VT and extend VT link all the way to Colaba. And went, had a presentation, nothing much came out of it. Again, now in the current railway budget, the Minister for Railways, she is planning feasibility study still, after 1970, we are in year 2010, feasibility study between the two stations, that is city station, Churchgate and VT, and we are just going to talk about it. And second important point which Parag mentioned about mixed usage. There is so much of land locked right from here all the way to about 15 kilometers called Bombay Port Trust. That land is not used at all. It is just lying like that. We can have a garden, a park stretching from here all the way there, public housing, private housing, schools, colleges, whatever we want. But there is no will. And some young members of CMU alumni should take up these issues. Thank you.
One observation that comes out of this, and a truism of all the things you guys work on, is that they take a very long time. Even if you don't have sort of the kind of political upsets that are experienced from time to time, they just take a long time, especially transportation projects. Infrastructure of any kind is just long-lived, long planning cycle. So all this observation about political leadership and political will, it has to be sustained too. It can't just be in a moment in time. Other questions or comments? Last one.
This question is for Parag. There's a statistic that's thrown around that by 2020, the population of Mumbai, about 60% of the population of Mumbai will be living in slums. At this rate of urbanization, do you foresee that sustainable development can coexist with the need for public housing in a cost-effective manner to meet our needs?
I think there is no choice. Sustainable development is the only solution, because to have development which is only targeted to a section of the society will not let the city grow, or will not let the city absorb growth. So sustainable city policies like smart growth looks at a much more broader spectrum, where, as he said, we look at even social sustainability. So if any development is sustainable, it should be accessible to all. It is not just the few green platinum rated buildings that make a city sustainable, or few fuel efficient cars that make the transport system sustainable. So if the strategies which CMU is taking first steps in, like smart growth, sustainable city development, applied to sustainable city development, you will see, that is the only option left. I don't think we will have in 5 years to sell a concept as an architect to a client, let's talk of sustainability. It will by default be integrated with other environmental issues, social issues, which affect a larger number of populace. Otherwise, you will have social divides. You will have gated communities for the super rich, and the slums still remaining by the side. So unless city planning looks at this issue holistically, I don't think...
The political will that Sanjay talked about is the people in this room. It's you, and it's the people you network with, and the people you do business with are going to make this happen. And it reminded me of something at Carnegie Mellon. Bill McDonough, who was a very famous architect in the United States, one of the pioneers in sustainable development, came to give a lecture, and I was asked to introduce him to the lecture, And he started off his lecture, unbelievably, here's another Native American quote that he said. He started off his lecture, it was, "What we have is because someone stood up before us. What our seventh generation will have is a consequence of our actions today." So that's kind of a... But then he followed that with a statement that I'll never forget. This must have been 20 years ago. He said, 7 generations ago in the United States was the generation of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. And he said, what will the seventh generation ahead of us think of what we're doing right now on this earth? And that's so profound, so profound. And so we have to do something. They just say, you have to do something.
No, this is such a great note to end on. I'm not gonna allow any more questions or comments. When we're done here, of course, we're gonna go back to the reception, and I know they'd love to continue the conversation. That was a great note to end on. We clearly have just scratched the surface of what is a very large and very important challenge and problem for Mumbai, for India, and for the world. We're very proud of Carnegie Mellon. I'm proud of Carnegie Mellon, of the role that we played in developing the ideas of sustainable design and educating the people that are doing it, are bringing it to the world. Please join me in thanking our 2 panelists, Don Carter and Parag Parekh.